Many knew the legend, very few understood the silence that built it. October 17, 1929, a quiet Thursday night on Staten Island's Huguenot Beach, the kind of night where the Atlantic wind carried salt and secrets in equal measure. A man stumbled onto the sand, his tailored suit soaked in blood, his face unrecognizable beneath the damage. 50 stab wounds marked his body. His throat had been slashed. He'd been left to die like discarded cargo on the shore. But when the police arrived, expecting to catalog another nameless victim in New York's endless violence, the man did something that would echo through the criminal underworld for decades. He refused to say who did it, not because he didn't know, because he understood something most men never learn. Power isn't always about revenge. Sometimes it's about what you choose not to say. His name was Charles Luciano. The world would come to know him as Lucky, and what happened that night didn't break him. It forged the blueprint for modern, organized crime. But the real story was never only about survival. The boy who would reshape the American underworld was born Salvatore Lucania in 1897 in a small Sicilian village where poverty wasn't just economic, it was existential. His family sailed to New York when he was 9, landing in Manhattan's Lower East Side, where immigrant children learned quickly that America's streets offered two educations, the one in classrooms and the one in alleyways. Young Salvatore chose the latter, not from cruelty but from clarity. He saw that respect in his neighborhood didn't come from books or badges. It came from understanding the unwritten rules of survival, from knowing when to fight and when to calculate, from building alliances that mattered more than muscle alone. By his teenage years, he was running with a gang that included a young Mayor Lansky and Benjamin Siegel, three boys from different worlds, Jewish and Italian, bound by something stronger than ethnic loyalty, ambition. While older gangsters clung to old-world feuds and territorial thinking, Salvatore saw something they couldn't. The future wasn't going to belong to those who fought over scraps. It would belong to those who organized the chaos into enterprise. He changed his name to Charles Luciano, a small gesture that carried profound meaning. He was shedding the immigrant weight, becoming American in the most ruthless way possible. What people called legendary often began as something deeply personal. By the mid-1920s, Luciano had become indispensable. He worked for Joe Masseria, one of New York's most powerful Italian crime bosses, but he wasn't just an enforcer. He was a thinker. While Prohibition turned the country into a laboratory for organized crime, Luciano understood that the real money wasn't in street-level violence. It was in structure, in partnerships, in treating crime like a business rather than a blood sport. He built relationships across ethnic lines, something the old guard considered treacherous. He talked to Jewish mobsters, Irish bootleggers, and even corrupt politicians with the same calculated respect. He didn't see borders, he saw opportunity. But that vision carried risk, because not everyone wanted the world to change. Salvatore Maranzano was the other titan of Italian organized crime in New York, and he represented everything Luciano was trying to leave behind. Maranzano believed in the old Sicilian model, rigid hierarchies, ethnic purity, and power maintained through fear and tradition. He saw himself as a modern-day Caesar, organizing crime families like Roman legions. And he saw young upstarts like Luciano as threats to that order. By 1929, tension between Masseria and Maranzano was building toward war. The Castellammare War, they would call it later. A brutal conflict that would claim dozens of lives and reshape the entire criminal landscape of New York. Luciano was caught in the middle, publicly loyal to Masseria, privately calculating his own path, and that calculation made him dangerous to everyone. It looked like mastery. It did not feel that simple. The night of October 17, 1929, started like any other evening in Luciano's world. He was at a restaurant on the Lower East Side, meeting with associates. Handling business, around 10:45 p.m., three men approached his table. Men he knew, men he'd worked with. They told him someone wanted to talk, important business, a quick ride. In his world, you didn't refuse such invitations, not if you wanted to maintain respect. So Luciano excused himself, straightened his tie, and walked out into the cold October night. He climbed into a black sedan. The door closed behind him with a sound that felt final, though he didn't know it yet. They drove north, out of Manhattan, across the Bayonne Bridge into Staten Island. The conversation stayed light at first. Business talk, mutual friends, the kind of coded language men in their world used when the real conversation sat beneath the words. But as the car moved farther from the city lights into darker, emptier roads, Luciano felt the shift. The atmosphere tightening, the jokes stopping. He'd survived this long by reading rooms, by sensing when the air changed. And he knew somewhere in that drive that he wasn't going to a meeting, he was going to his execution. What happened next changed the meaning of everything that came before. They pulled onto a desolate stretch near Huguenot Beach, the kind of place where the ocean swallowed sound and the darkness swallowed witnesses. The car stopped. Luciano was pulled out. He didn't beg. He didn't plead, he met their eyes, and then the violence began, fists first, brass knuckles that shattered his jaw, then knives, dozens of stabs, slashes across his face, his torso, his arms, 50 wounds in total, the medical examiner would later count. They cut his throat, the blade opening his neck in a way that should have been final. They dumped him on the beach, face down in the sand and blood, and drove away, left him to bleed out where no one would find him until morning, if at all. As far as they were concerned, Charles Luciano was finished, but the confidence in his presence did not mean certainty existed within him. Somehow, through will or fortune or something harder to name, Luciano didn't die. He crawled, inch by inch across the sand, choking on his own blood, vision blurred, body screaming. He made it to a road. A passing motorist saw him, illuminated by headlights, a broken shape that barely looked human. The police were called, an ambulance arrived. The doctors at the hospital couldn't believe he was alive. 50 stab wounds, throat slashed, jaw fractured, face mutilated, and yet his heart kept beating, his lungs kept pulling air. They stabilized him, stitched him back together as best they could, and waited for him to talk, because that's what victims did. They told the police who hurt them. They pressed charges. They sought justice through the system. That was the expectation, the protocol, the reasonable thing to do. But Luciano wasn't reasonable, and he understood something about power that the police never would. When the detectives came to his hospital bed, notebooks ready, he looked at them through swollen eyes and said 3 words, "I don't know. You don't know who did this to you?" They asked, incredulous. "No," he said, his voice raspy, damaged but steady. "I don't remember anything." They pressed, they threatened, they promised protection, but Luciano's answer never changed. He didn't know, he didn't remember, he had nothing to say. The newspapers ate it up. Mystery attack on mobster, the headlines screamed. Luciano refuses to name attackers. Speculation ran wild. Was it a rival gang, a personal vendetta, a power play in the underworld? Everyone had theories, no one had answers, because the only man who knew the truth had chosen silence as his weapon, and that silence changed everything. The underworld heard the message loud and clear. Luciano had been nearly killed, left for dead, and he hadn't broken the code. He hadn't run to the police. He hadn't begged for protection. He'd taken the beating, survived the impossible, and kept his mouth shut. That kind of discipline, that kind of control, commanded a respect that violence alone could never earn. The old bosses, men like Masseria and Maranzano, saw a soldier who understood loyalty. Cellular level, the younger generation saw something else, a man who played by rules deeper than the old guard could comprehend. But there was something no one around him could fully understand. Luciano knew exactly who had ordered the attack. He knew the faces of the men who stabbed him. He knew why it happened. He'd been getting too powerful, too independent, too much of a threat to the established order. Someone had decided to clip his wings before he could fly too high. But here's the thing about silence. It's not the same as forgiveness. It's not the same as weakness. Sometimes silence is the longest, coldest form of revenge. By refusing to name names, Luciano hadn't surrendered power. He'd consolidated it. He'd shown the entire criminal world that he operated on a different level, that he could absorb violence, survive death, and still move with purpose, that he didn't need the police, didn't need the system, didn't need anyone's protection but his own. He built a world that looked controlled, even while carrying burdens no one could see. 2 years later, in 1931, the Castle Amherst War reached its bloody conclusion. Masseria was killed in a Coney Island restaurant, shot multiple times while eating lunch. Maranzano declared himself boss of bosses, restructuring the Italian families in New York into a hierarchy modeled on the Roman Empire. He believed he'd won. He believed the old ways would hold. He was wrong. 5 months after taking power, Maranzano was murdered in his office, killed by men dressed as police officers. And when the smoke cleared, when the bodies were counted and the new structure emerged, Charles Luciano stood at the center of it all, not as boss of bosses. He rejected that title, that arrogance, that outdated thinking. Instead, he created something new, the Commission, a board of directors for organized crime. 5 families in New York, each with autonomy, each with representation, all bound by rules they agreed to follow. No more wars over ego, no more old world feuds, just business, just structure, just the most profitable criminal organization America had ever seen. And at the heart of that transformation was a man who'd been left to die on a beach and chose silence over revenge, strategy over impulse, the long game over the quick kill. The image was real, so was the silence afterward. In the decades that followed, Luciano became a name synonymous with power, with innovation, with the modernization of organized crime. He was convicted on prostitution charges in 1936. Sentenced to 30 to 50 years, but even from behind bars his influence held. During World War II, the U.S. government made a deal with him. Help protect the New York docks from sabotage, use your connections to support the invasion of Sicily, and we'll commute your sentence. He delivered. The government released him in 1946, but deported him to Italy, where he lived the rest of his life in exile, still connected, still consulted, still feared and respected across an ocean. He died in 1962 at Naples Airport, collapsing from a heart attack while meeting with a Hollywood producer who wanted to make a movie about his life. 64 years old. His body was returned to New York and buried in St. John's Cemetery in Queens. Thousands attended his funeral. Mobsters, politicians, businessmen, and ordinary people who understood that whatever else he was, Lucky Luciano had been a force that reshaped the American underworld forever. But here's the thing history often forgets, the thing that makes his story human beneath the legend. That night on Staten Island, when he crawled across the sand with his life bleeding out onto the beach, he made a choice, not just to survive, not just to stay silent, but to prove something to himself and to the world watching. That power isn't about how much violence you can inflict. It's about how much you can endure and still move forward. That loyalty isn't about blind obedience. It's about understanding which rules matter and which rules were made to be rewritten. That legacy isn't built on fear alone. It's built on the moments when you could break, when you should break, when every rational instinct tells you to break and you choose not to. What people called legendary often began as something deeply personal. Lucky Luciano never publicly spoke about what happened that night. Not in interviews, not in court testimony, not even to close associates in his final years. The identity of his attackers remained a secret he took to his grave. Some historians believe it was a faction within Masseria's organization testing his loyalty. Others think it was Maranzano's people trying to eliminate a rising threat. A few suggest it was a personal vendetta, something smaller and more human than grand criminal strategy. The truth is, it doesn't matter who held the knives. What matters is what Luciano did with the scars. He turned trauma into mythology, silence into power, near death into rebirth. And in doing so, he set a template that criminals, businessmen, and strategists would study for generations. The idea that sometimes the most devastating response isn't retaliation. It's patience. It's control. It's the willingness to absorb the hit, learn from it, and come back stronger without ever explaining yourself to the people who expect you to break. The confidence in his presence did not mean certainty existed within him. When you look at photographs of Lucky Luciano, especially the ones taken after 1929, there's something you notice if you pay attention. The eyes. They're sharp, intelligent, calculating, but they also carry a weight, a distance, the kind of expression that comes from knowing what it feels like to be left for dead and choosing not to let that knowledge destroy you. He built an empire. He created structures that outlasted him. He became the blueprint for organized crime in America, but beneath all that power, beneath the legend and the mythology and the Hollywood versions of his life, there was a man who understood something most people never have to learn. That survival is only the first part. What you do with it afterward is what defines you. The story of Lucky Luciano is often told as a tale of crime, of violence, of the birth of the American mafia, and all of that is true, but it's also a story about resilience, about the choice to endure, about the power of silence in a world that demands confessions, about the long game in a culture obsessed with instant gratification, about the difference between revenge and strategy, between impulse and discipline, between breaking under pressure and becoming something harder in the fire. And perhaps most importantly, it's a story about what it means to be truly lucky, not because fortune smiles on you, But because when fortune abandons you, when you're bleeding out on a beach with 50 holes in your body and every reason to give up, you find something inside yourself that refuses to quit. You crawl, you survive, you rebuild, and you never ever tell them what they want to hear. That was Lucky Luciano's real power. Not the money, not the organization, not the political connections or the criminal empire. It was the ability to take the worst moment of his life and transform it into the foundation of his legend, to turn vulnerability into mystique, to make silence more powerful than any confession, to prove that sometimes the man who walks away from death without saying a word commands more respect than the one who shouts the loudest. And that is where the legend became something more human. Many knew the legend, the boss who modernized. Organized crime, the strategist who created the commission, the man who survived 50 stab wounds and built an empire from the scars, but very few understood the hunger that built it, the quiet determination of an immigrant kid who refused to accept the limits the world placed on him, the calculated risk of a young gangster who saw opportunity where others saw only tradition, the cold discipline of a man bleeding out on a beach who chose silence over survival instinct. That hunger came from somewhere much deeper, from the knowledge that power is fragile, that life is uncertain, that the only thing you truly control is how you respond when everything else falls apart. Lucky Luciano understood that, he lived it, and in the end that understanding became his most valuable asset, more valuable than money, more enduring than violence, more powerful than fear. The real story was never only about what happened that night on Staten Island. It was about what didn't happen, the name he didn't say, the revenge he didn't take, the weakness he didn't show. And in that negative space, in that deliberate absence, a legend was born that would outlive the man himself. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing at all. And Lucky Luciano proved it with 50 scars and a silence that still echoes nearly a century later.